fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Oh, welcome back into the House of Mystery. Of course, I'm Al Warren. We got Mr. Michael the Ripper in Buffalo Cold Holly.
That is correct. The wind chill will be minus 30 tomorrow. I'm all excited about that.
Yeah, that'll get you going. I'll tell you. You'll be all ready.
That's right.
All running and excited and get out there and shovel and whatever else. Well, somebody's got to do it, you know. We have got an author with us, and he's got quite a history. We can talk about that too. But his latest book is Black Dahlia, and it's Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Mid-Century Hollywood. William J. Mann, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, so that's a long title. You know, I'm getting tired here. It's just, at this age, I can't see as well, and it's like, holy cow, there's more words. One thing I noticed about you from before is that you've done a lot of Hollywood, right? You know, Marlon
Right.
Brando, Bogey Bacall, and Tinseltown. Like, you've got a lot of stuff covering, you know, more of that style. How did you get into Black Dahlia?
Well, you mentioned Tinseltown. I did that book in 2014. And it was a departure. It was telling the story of another unsolved Hollywood murder or Los Angeles murder. And I enjoyed that process because it allowed me to tell a bigger story than when I focus on one individual, or in the case of Bogey and Bacall, two individuals. You know, I could tell the story of a community, of an industry. Many people follow the narrative threads throughout, you know, various different communities and different individuals, and it was very fulfilling to write Tinseltown. I was able to tell the story of how the Hollywood film industry came into being, how the structures of the studio system were created in the aftermath of William Desmond Taylor's murder, and how that murder helped shape how we would see movies being made for the next 40 years. And yes, I was interested in trying to dissect the murder a little bit and to try to come up with some possible solutions. But it was really telling this bigger story. So when my editor suggested that I try another true crime, I was game. And I had to look for something that could do the same thing for me, where I could tell a bigger story and, you know, look at the city of Los Angeles in this period of time, the postwar era, when so many changes were going on. And I realized that, okay, you know, the Black Dahlia story has been done before, you know, many times, maybe too many times, but I thought I could do something different because I could use the same techniques I used on Tinseltown and to, you know, widen that story. So using the unsolved murder to really get into the time and the context and the place of Los Angeles in mid-century.
So you had a good background.
Yeah, it was all about the background, really. I mean, I had to make sure that Los Angeles became a character, that the period of time that, you know, that kind of anxious post-war era, you know, the war was over. You know, everybody thought people would be feeling, stress-free and renewed and confident. But in fact, there was so much tension because there was so much social change going on. So I wanted to be able to recreate that to help us understand the story of Elizabeth Short.
So when you went to write this book, you decided on this case. What were you hoping to get out of the book? Like, what was it you were hoping to discover? Were you writing this to discover what really happened to her, to figure out the murder? What was your angle here?
It was less about finding the killer than it was about finding the victim. I really thought, after looking at the case and the previous work that's been done, that Elizabeth Short was, she was mythologized. She was turned into the name, the Black Dahlia, which had nothing to do with her as a person. It was a name that came after she was dead. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to try to give her back some of her agency and some of her own history, And previous books basically begin when they find the body. So we know very little about this woman. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to really focus in on finding Elizabeth Short. And then, of course, in the context of that, exploring the investigation of her murder, how that happened, why that happened, how the press treated it, how the law enforcement treated it, how Hollywood treated it, because it became a trope, really, in film noir after this. So I wanted to understand all of that. And if in the process I could maybe eliminate some of the suspects, I figured I'd like to do that. I never attempted to find the killer and be able to say I've solved this case now, though I think I've proposed a pretty solid suspect, at least one who, unlike the others, can't be easily exonerated.
Right. So you found Michael.
I was there. I'm a little. Yeah. That was 80 years ago, but I'm only. 116.
Yeah, well, if you're 116, you're a possible suspect then.
Yeah, there you go. I knew it. So what were the biggest misconceptions or the biggest stories about Elizabeth Short that were not real? Like, because there's all sorts of stuff, if she was a hooker or a prostitute.
Right.
There's all sorts of stories that different people took as an angle. And in a way, it was a way of selling as well.
Exactly.
Say, what did you find that was the big ones?
Well, it was this case sold a lot of newspapers. In fact, Jimmy Richardson, who was the editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, said the Black Dahlia case sold more newspapers for him than Pearl Harbor had done. So they were hell bent to keep the story going for as long as possible. And when they didn't have new news, they literally made stuff up. So, and so they turned Elizabeth Short from this, this young woman who was, exploring the world, kind of finding her place, and into this sultry, seductive figure who walked by night and had all these sinister men following her. And, she was a sex worker in some of the stories, or she was working with gangsters in another one, or she was like this Hollywood wannabe. She wanted to be a big star and she was willing to do anything to get a part. And none of that was true. And that's what I think was most surprising for me. And what I really discovered that, this book had to put those myths aside, really had to put those to rest and allow the real woman to come forward, because then we understand her story a little bit better. Some of the newspapers and some of the pundits back then actually, implicitly blamed her for her own death. If she wasn't out there on the street, if she wore less sexy clothes, maybe this wouldn't have happened to her. And that's an old trope. We still see that today, where women are blamed for violence against them. And, and I just really wanted to tell that story, find this young woman and, present her life perhaps more as she would have seen her life herself.
So when you get to the press, I often wonder, I do a lot of writing in the 60s and 70s, and I'm surprised at how wild the stories were that were coming out of, reputable or large newspapers.
Right.
And I'm, and I hear so much today. There's so much stuff with the internet, of course, and about how the fake news or the media and all this stuff. And I wished it was back in the Walter Cronkite days. And I hear all this stuff, but the more I research, like with the Manson case, they were calling, that Sharon Tate was basically having sex parties.
Right.
They were killing a goat and all. And this is the major press coming out with this. And I'm thinking, well, that's just as bad as today. So I'm surprised at that the press, I guess it's just new. I've learned a lot of this stuff. So I guess you have to really kind of go through which articles you can get good information from or not because of that.
Right, exactly. Well, and, there were 5 daily newspapers in Los Angeles at that time, and they were all, competing against each other. Somebody got a scoop one day, the next one had to get a scoop that topped that. It was just this, we don't think about it today because newspapers don't have the same role place in society that they did back then. But it was, everybody read these newspapers, and most people read 2 or 3 newspapers every day. And the Hearst, the William Randolph Hearst papers, which was the Examiner and the Herald Express, they tended to be the worst in terms of sensationalizing and literally making stuff up. But the Daily News was pretty outrageous too. And even the LA Times tended to be the most serious, the most sober in its reporting. But even sometimes they went full hog and threw some big sensational story on the paper.
So a question on that, I was just going to ask, there's so many parallels to, I do research Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders of 1888. Right. Same thing was going on, and exactly was going on. Even though yellow journalism was a little after that, right. Then how did you, so I always did, my research, I try to corroborate, right. And then there was no physical evidence. Was there any physical evidence left over, and could you corroborate any of these stories?
Well, it was, the body had been drained of blood, had been scrubbed. So there was very little. People often ask me, was there any DNA evidence that could be found? Well, the killer knew what they were doing in terms of scrubbing that body and making sure there was nothing left there. There were some materials that were sent to the press that had been, like Elizabeth's address book, some letters she'd wrote, and some photographs. And it's assumed that the killer sent those photos, but the police never said for certain that it was the killer, though that's kind of seeped into the lore that the killer sent those things. And those were really the only physical evidence we had. The body was autopsied, and the stomach contents were examined and reported, and they found no semen. She hadn't been raped. She wasn't pregnant. So we knew some things about her death, but the killer really was very shrewd in making sure that there were no leads that would lead directly back to him or her.
When you look at this case now, and you've done the book, and you know her better, and the person who Elizabeth Short was, right, more than before, what could be the possible motive to her being murdered? Because of the headlines and the other books all talking about, she was, a sex worker, or she got someone wrong. Like, they kind of make her look like, she's this person that's in trouble, so it's kind of her own fault.
Right, right.
And, it's ridiculous. But now that you kind of know who she is better as a person, was there something that led you to a different kind of, reason?
Well, even one of the detectives, who was generally a very good detective, and he didn't allow himself to become emotionally involved, but even he said, well, she must have just teased one man too far. She just, teased the wrong man, and then he exploded. I think that's way too simple in terms of understanding, though I do think that the fact that she was struck in the head first, that was the cause of death, really was because of the blunt object that she was hit on the head with. And it does seem to me that perhaps the killer was responding something that she had done. Maybe she had laughed at him. She was given that Glasgow smile with, the Joker smile with the cheeks cut up to the ears. So that could have been it. But ultimately that would have been impulsive. The killer, there was so much more going on here that ultimately I don't think the murder had really anything to do with Elizabeth Short. She just happened to be there. This was somebody who had rage and resentment against the world, and decided to, in that moment, perhaps impulsively, perhaps not, to make Elizabeth an example of that. And the way the body was then displayed in this vacant lot in the middle of a suburban new housing tract for men who had come back from the war and their wives, and they all had young children. So this was a deliberate place to put this body, to offend the world that the killer seems to have had a great deal of rage towards. So the actual trigger may have been something Elizabeth Short did, but ultimately this killer was going to explode somewhere on someone at some point.
Question, that sounds like a serial offender motive. Did you, and it's in many cases we know that serial killers, have a series of kills.
Right.
Did you investigate any decades before, decades after, anything like that?
I did, and I investigated, but so did the district attorney. The LAPD in 1948 had kind of gone off the rails in the investigation, so the DA had to step in. And it was a pretty thorough investigation. It wasn't conclusive by any means, but they really did look at things. And the conclusion was that none of the other murders that happened before or after Elizabeth Short were connected. There was just no signature that linked them. That doesn't mean there wasn't. I mean, you can only generalize about serial killers so much. It's perfect. I had talked to a number of detectives who said, yeah, he may have, this killer may have killed once and then was done with it, never felt the need to do it, or he may have waited another 20 years, or, you can't completely generalize about psychopathic killers. But in fact, there is nothing that links this crime with anything else. It's just, this crime is unique. There's been nothing like it before or since.
Yeah, it's crazy. So when you look at the other books out and some of the other suspects, did you go through those as well? Did you kind of go through, like the George Hodell's father and all the other ones that sort of were put in, or did you just put that aside and not pay attention?
No, I looked at all of these suspects who the district attorney entertained at one point. So the district attorney looked at all of those people who had not been cleared. So they had an awful lot of original suspects who were, eventually were found alibis for, or the police had eventually said this person had nothing to do with it. But there was still a list of about 20 suspects that the DA compiled. Some were not really serious. It was just kind of a matter of, including these names for thoroughness, for completion. But there were probably about 4 or 5 that seemed plausible to the DA, and then also to myself. And I really spent time going through all of them. And I found that there was only one suspect that I couldn't completely exonerate. Based on the evidence, most of the other suspects, when you weigh it all together, were very, very unlikely to have killed Elizabeth Short. However, there was one suspect, who I do name in the book, who I couldn't do that for. That he had all of he had the skills to do the kind of surgical bisection of the body. He had the rage and the resentment at society, and he had a personal connection with Elizabeth Short. So, I couldn't exonerate him, but the others, including Hodell and others, there just wasn't evidence that linked them to Elizabeth Short. That, just no credible evidence. Yeah,
it's one of those. It's been all over the place. I think it's just behind Zodiac for
right, right.
Everyone's dad,
right? Exactly.
When you write a story like this, do you find yourself getting into the mind of, let's say, your victim, like in this case Elizabeth Short? Did you kind of try to get into her lifestyle and who she was and mind?
Yeah, I really did, and I was fortunate that I was able to come across a collection that was kept in the Historical Society of her hometown of Medford, Massachusetts, and it was about a couple decades ago. A childhood friend of Elizabeth Short interviewed Short family members, and never used those interviews in a book, but they're all preserved in the Historical Society. And the stories that her sisters told allowed me to see Elizabeth, what she was like as a child, what her home life was like, how she interacted with her mother and her sisters. And that was really allowed me to start putting together a more complete picture of this young woman who, as I said, usually in these books is just a corpse. And that was really helpful. I was so glad to find those materials.
When you do a book like this, you can't really choose the outcome. What's happened. It's nonfiction, true crime and stuff. And a lot of, at least with fictional murder writers, they can give justice, it could have a good outing and stuff like that.
Right.
So when you kind of go through this sort of case and you get into her head and live with her really for the length of time it takes you to write the book, does writing a book like this change you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would love to see justice for Elizabeth Short. I don't know if we'll ever know for certain that justice was given to her. However, I hope that my book really fleshes her out and gives her back her humanity. This was a young woman who had a lot of curiosity. She had wanderlust. She wanted to see the world. She wanted to have adventures. She didn't stay home in her suburban New England town. She went off to explore and make new friends and always wanted to see new places. And that's that's who I wanted to try to recreate and bring back to life. So if anything, that's as close to maybe justice that we can give her. And I feel this with all of my books, whether it's just the Hollywood biographies or whatever. You spend so much time with a person and you're reading the most private things about them and you're following them from point A to B to C. And you start to care about them. You have empathy for them. And I certainly felt that way with Elizabeth Short. I definitely can say from the start of my research, which when I knew nothing about the case and nothing about Elizabeth Short, to the end, I definitely was changed because I realized this was a young woman like many young women I know today who are, forging their own lives and careers and, kind of saying, putting marriage on hold and saying, I want to see what I want from life. And she, so she stays with you. And I have gotten people to say that to me who have read the book, that they feel like they got to know her a little bit. And that makes me very happy.
So you gave her a voice.
Yeah, I tried to.
When you said this earlier about making L.A. a character, like you had to write it as a character, I always find with mine too, my writing, do you find that you have to make the time period also a character so that people really understand how people lived at that time? Absolutely.
The time is so important. I sometimes I'll read biographies or true crime, and you have no sense of when this is taking place, and that you just can't live that way. Our times shape us. A story of Los Angeles in the Great Depression is going to be very different than Los Angeles in postwar, or later on in the 1960s or the 70s. So you really do have to make the period, the time frame, a strong element in your narrative, because it informs everything. How do people, who thinks a certain way, how things are done. It's vital. You really need that time and place.
Yeah, I find that's true too. If you can't, you miss out so much. Plus, it also leaves a hole into why people are acting or reacting certain ways.
Exactly.
It's not 2020, so they don't have
exactly.
the same lifestyle.
That's right.
A huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you hope everyone gets from the book?
I hope they get to realize this young woman had far more agency than previous studies have given her credit for, that she in no way deserved her fate. In no way did she bring about her fate. She was a victim, she was victimized by a very brutal and dangerous individual. But even though she was victimized, victim doesn't really fit her, because the victim implies that, she had no power when she did. And, she came up against something that she wasn't able to surmount, but she had survived a lot before that. And she had, taken chances and risks. And, sometimes was completely fickle and perhaps a bit immature, but at the same time, she was going about her life, and that's the piece. I think her life, as short as it was, should be told. And one thing I like to say is that her death was notorious and grisly, and her life was fairly ordinary and unremarkable, but her life is still more important than her death.
And you said the one suspect that you've got.
Yes.
And you're talking about, did that person, I take it it's a man, but did he show any signs of this kind of behavior before? Like, was it kind of something you could look at, things he had done maybe, and you kind of go, wow, and nobody noticed? Or was it just sort of out of the blue?
Yeah, no, there was definitely signs. And in fact, when I was reading through his military records, he had served in World War II, and seeing the psychiatric discharge that he was given, and the fact that he was discharged at 50% psychiatric disability, and what he did in the Army, and I said, why hasn't he been a more prominent suspect? Why have there been all these stories about George Hodel, who never even knew Elizabeth Short? Why? Here's a guy that, all the records, we know that they lived together, we know that they dated, and he's got all of this background, and then of course I find out that he was, he had a record for arrest, he'd been committing fraud, he was involved with the Chicago mob for a while. I'm like, why hasn't this guy been front and center before? Why am I just discovering him? So yeah, there's definitely a background case that can be traced for him in terms of possibly being the killer. And again, I don't come out and say I've solved it and that he is the killer, because there are still records that the LAPD has not released, and who knows what's in those records. So I'm cautious where I say, like, this is the one guy I couldn't disprove, and I think he's the most likely case, but we don't know because there's still so much records that we don't have.
Well, Chicago mob, that would infer possible violent, prone to violent activities or something.
Oh yes, exactly.
Well, so where do you go next? Now that you've done this, what are you going to take a break? Or are you going to write a comedy, romance? Like what?
That would be a relief. That would be a relief. I'm not sure. We're looking at a few things, and I'll probably be making decisions soon, because it's what I do. I love researching, and I need to find something that I'm going to be happy to be involved in for the next 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, it's hard just to sit and do nothing.
Right,
isn't it?
it is.
Now let's see. For people that are listening, do you have a website? Do you have social media? Do you have places that people can find you and contact you?
Yeah, sure. My website is williamjmann.com, and I'm on Instagram at the real Mr. Mann.
The real Mr.
The real Mr. Mann.
Well, there you go. You have it, everyone.
Right.
We will put all of that up on our website as well, so people can find it and find you. And what can I say? We appreciate you being here.
Hey, thanks for asking me.
Yeah, the book, everyone. Black Dahlia, Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Mid-Century Hollywood. And it's William J. Mann. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great speaking with you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.